Would really like to see any of the big Sony devs just make a high quality fantasy game. They've been making realistic games for ages now. I mean, like, you can have a realistic looking fantasy game. Honestly, I don't really care, like, if the graphics are, like, photorealistic or, like, trying to be as detailed as possible. I don't give a fuck as long as it looks good. Like the art style is inspired, you know? But even then, I don't have a problem with hyperrealism or whatever. It's just kind of getting old at this point. Remember, graphics didn't matter? Graphics have always mattered. The only reason people ever buy new video game consoles or graphics cards or anything is because of graphics. That's how they sell you on the console. Anytime a new console is announced, the first thing they show off is the pretty graphics. They don't say, like in marketing material or whatever, never says anything about fucking, oh, well, now we've got like this many gigs of video memory in commercials. Never say anything like that because it doesn't sell. It's the graphics that matter. Graphics have always mattered, and I'd argue that they matter less now with small indie games with widely varied graphics being so popular. Yeah, that's the thing as well. It's like, you know what? Actually, I think Nintendo is the only company that doesn't really market their consoles based on graphics alone. The Switch was all about, you know, its central gimmick of being portable and a console and like playing with friends and stuff. That's cool. But graphics have and always will matter. Graphics aren't what's important anymore. It's all about aesthetics. Yeah. I mean, like, graphics are important. They might not, like, matter a whole lot to you personally, but, like, industry-wise, it's very important. I always thought that the game from a PS2 era that went for more cel-shaded graphics aged better than games with more realistic graphics that date the game more than it should. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, everything's gonna feel dated, right? I don't think dated is a bad thing, though. MGS2, Devil May Cry, and Resident Evil 4, the games from that era have realistic graphics and still look good today. Well, then it's a case-by-case basis thing on your logic. Because you said that cel-shaded graphics age better than games with more realistic-looking graphics, but then you named a bunch of realistic-looking games that do look good. So it seems like from that logic, it's a case-by-case basis. Whereas I'd argue that I don't think anything inherently makes a game look good or bad. And I don't think a game looking of its time is a bad thing either. Like, this game doesn't have cel-shaded or particularly cartoony or realistic art style, but it still looks like a PS2 game, even though it's like, you know, like kind of like an anime style. I think it still looks good. Dated isn't a bad thing. Original KH1, yeah. Well, yeah, dated has like such a negative connotation, but like being of its time, I don't think is a bad thing at all. Sometimes low quality or bad graphics is an aesthetic. Yeah, sometimes, but that's not really what I'm going for. Because like, well, like, yeah, pixel art isn't really the same as photorealism. I wouldn't say pixel art is bad because it's not as detailed as photorealism. They're two completely separate forms of like art, right? They're going for completely separate things. I feel like the argument is more along the lines that cel-shaded graphics age more gracefully next to games that were specifically lauded for having high quality graphics around the same time. Yeah, so this is an argument. So I hesitate to readily adopt arguments that I hear from a lot of different people like that, like common like sentiments like a game with a distinct art style will probably age better than a game that's going exactly for photorealism. And I get where that sentiment comes from, because the aging better is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because how do I say this? When people are like saying something aged poorly, they're saying it doesn't look like it looks like it came from when it did, instead of like you could mistake it for coming out like today sort of thing. So a cel-shaded game from the PS2 era, that sort of graphical style looked really good back then, and it still looks good today because it just looks like a cartoon, right? Whereas a game like Devil May Cry, for example, wasn't going for any particular cartoony look. It was going for a more like realistic, grounded approach. And that realistic, grounded approach changes with each generation of graphics because graphic capabilities become more, you know, complex. So comparing the photorealistic approach of a PS2 game, or the grounded realistic approach of a PS2 game to the grounded realistic approach of a PS4 game, people are gonna be like, this game aged poorly because it doesn't hold up to modern standards or whatever. Sentiments like that I hear a lot, and whenever I hear a sentiment expressed by a lot of people in largely the same way, I try and actually understand what is being said and see if it's actually, like, if I actually agree with it or not. And I don't agree with that at all, because I don't think a game needs to, like, hold up to modern standards for it to be worth playing, or, like, I don't think it's fair for a game to be written off as dated or, like, not worth going back to or doesn't hold up because like, technology has evolved, you know? Or design capabilities or design philosophies have evolved. I think... I said this a lot, but the context around its release, a piece of art is heavily influenced by the time it came from. That includes, you know, of course, graphical capabilities as well as design philosophies. I don't think it's fair to write off a game or an experience of any kind as dated because it obviously came from a time when it was produced, you know? I think, like, I just... Dated doesn't necessarily have to be like a negative term, but it has so much negative baggage to it. So I feel like the term of its time is a much better term to use because it's a lot more neutral. Then again, I do hear a lot of people say it with a negative connotation, but on its own, I think that's a more neutral term to use. I think it's better. I mean, like, if the game is so dated to the point where it's not fun, then yeah, it's bad. But if the game is still dated, but you can still pick it up and play it, no problem, then it really shouldn't matter. Well, I don't think a game looking a certain way affects its playability. Unless it's literally like a blurry mess. Which I don't think many games really are. If you're talking about to the point where it's not fun, that seems more like a controls problem or a design philosophy problem than it is a graphics problem or a design, like, art style problem. Jesus Christ. I mean, gameplay wise, well, we were talking about graphics, so, but gameplay wise, I think it's a similar argument, actually. For instance, this game, Dark Cloud, this game came out before, like, Devil May Cry, before Kingdom Hearts, before a lot of really influential 3D action games came out. So the foundation for what an action game in 3D could look like wasn't really set in stone. There wasn't really any, like, huge titles to really go off of. Everyone was just kind of trying their own stuff to, like, figure it out, you know? And so we've got rough gems like this where it's a bit clunky. It's not exactly a DMC5 experience, you know? Where it's, like, super smooth, incredibly deep, complex mechanics or whatever. But you can tell it was made with a lot of care. It was made in a time where this sort of game wasn't common, so they were kind of figuring it out as they went along. And yeah, the design philosophies and stuff like that don't exactly... they're not exactly on par with the Devil May Cry 5s of the world, you know? I don't think that's any reason to write it off as, like, well, it's hard to go back to because new games are better. It's like, well, no shit, they figured it out. This is before they figured it out. Like, I think it's valid for people to be like, oh, it's just a bit hard to, like, adapt to these older, more, like, archaic controls or design philosophy or whatever. But I don't think that's any reason to write it off as, like, oh, it's dated. Oh, it's not worth going back to. I don't think that's very fair. People always say Jak 1 didn't look like it belonged on the PS2, and I agree. When it's in HD, but goddamn, it looks like poo when I played on my PS2. Are you playing it with component cables? Are you playing it with composite cables on a LCD TV? Yeah, it's gonna look like absolute shit. Get some good cables, play on a CRT, and it looks fucking incredible. PS2 games look fucking incredible. Like, I'd say pretty much every console released still looks really good as long as you're hooking it up properly. And using the right means to play it, right? Like, what I'm playing my PS2 on right now, it looks fucking awful. I'm playing on an LCD TV with like a shitty HDMI upscaler. And yeah, it doesn't look great. I find a lot of old games thought realistic meant desaturated, which aesthetically isn't the best style to go for. Those games tend not to stand the test of time because when the graphics are no longer as high as what players come to expect, the poor color choices really start to affect the style more than it used to. If you're talking old games like PS3, Xbox 360 era, I get what you're saying. I think that's, again, like just like a design trend that I think we can look back on and be like, probably wasn't the best. Didn't have to do that. But I don't think it's worth like, oh man, these games are so dated and not worth going back to because the colors aren't as vibrant as they could have been. I don't know, I just hate attitudes where like people look at older games and like, oh well, this doesn't play exactly as good as this game that came out 2 days ago. Or it doesn't look as good as this fucking 8K ray traced 120 FPS game that came out today. I just hate attitudes like that. I think games and art should be viewed and experienced on their own terms, you know? Like a lot of older media, you do have to kind of meet halfway, and I think that effort should be made. I used to play it on a CRT when I was a kid. From what I remember, it was good back then, so I guess that's why it was a shock going to a newer TV. Well, there is a bit of like, you know, nostalgia memory trickery going on there, but yes, playing older systems on modern TVs look like fucking arse, trust me. I also feel like the perception of graphics is subjective. It depends on the person and what they believe looks good based on the perception of beauty and art. Well, I don't think that's really true. I think it is like what era you're looking at it in, sort of thing. Like this thing I've been saying. Like a lot of people today will be saying, you know, The Last of Us Part 1 remake looks incredible. It's like, oh my god, it's so incredible looking. 10, 20 years from now, they're gonna be like, oh, look at that. Jesus. It's sort of the same with the first game, right? Like, at the time, people were saying, like, you know, it's the best looking game ever. And now that technology has progressed, it looks a little rough. I think it still looks great. I still think PS2 grounded, realistic looking games look great. But a lot of people are quick to write off graphics because they've aged. I don't think that's very fair. I don't think it's a matter of subjectivity of what looks good. That is more of an aesthetic appreciation. Like, subjectivity in its aesthetics. Not really in, like, its graphics. Because, like, no one can really argue that The Last of Us Part 1 looks good. Because it does. It's, like, one of the most detailed games, like, graphically, ever made. You're kind of, like, objectively wrong if you think the graphics are bad, you know? Whether it, like, looks good on an aesthetic level, I think that's what's subjective. It's actually kind of mind-boggling to think of what games will look like in 20 years when they already look really great now. Been saying that for the whole time, you know? Every generation's like this, you know? Like, this is like the peak of graphics. And then the next generation comes and, like, technology gets better. Unfortunately, we're at the point now where, like, the technology is, like, getting better by small increments, but the time and effort, like, the human labor needed to, like, make these games look as good as they do, still remains the same. So people are, like, needing to put in more time and effort to make games look as good as they are nowadays. So, there's got to be, like, a breaking point, right? To the point where graphics can't really get much better. Like, jumping from PS4 to PS5, graphically, it's not much different, you know? It's just a matter of how much money you're willing to put into it, you know? That's what I'm saying, though. People's perception is subjective. I never said graphics themselves are a subjective field, but what people believe looks good. Yeah, I know. I'm saying I'm saying it's dumb. Because, like, actually, I don't think it is a subjective field whether graphics look good. Because, let's take person A, and they think, Metal Gear Solid 3 on PS2 looks incredible, peak of graphics. Next generation, The Last of Us, peak of graphics. Metal Gear Solid 4 looks like shit. This person has held two opposite positions on the same game, Metal Gear Solid 3. At one point they said it was incredible, but as graphic progressed, they would say it looks bad now, by modern standards, you know? That's not really subjectivity, that's just saying, well, technology has progressed, and this game doesn't look as cutting edge as it used to. I don't really think that's subjective. I think it's just like this kind of person only sees what is cutting edge as like looking good graphically, which is why I said like a more valid way of like the subjectivity in graphics is the aesthetics. I think that is entirely subjective whether or not it looks good to someone. Whereas like a game, like it's pure graphics, pretty much everyone universally agrees when a game is actually cutting edge, it's pretty much universally agreed upon that it looks good graphically, you know what I mean? But like when the game looks worse on stronger hardware than a game that came out on older hardware, there's really no excuse at that point. So wait. When a game looks worse on stronger hardware than a game that came out on older hardware, I understand that sentiment, but I guess worse is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because like, you know, worse is subjective. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it depends how worse. Because like, all I'm thinking of is like, well, I guess Infamous Second Son didn't look as good as The Last of Us, you know? But I don't really think either look bad, you know? This all spawned from me wanting fantasy games. Who else wants fantasy games? I mean, Final Fantasy 16 is coming out, Martian. It's got fantasy in the name. Actually, you know what? This whole like sentiment of like, you know, like, well, cel-shaded games look better in the long run than games going for realism. I mean, like, well, if that really is the case, then wouldn't the logical extension of that argument be that every game should be cel-shaded? You know what I mean? Every game needs to have some crazy aesthetic in order to hold up. I don't think that's really fair. Oh, it'd be nice if every game had an aesthetic that suits the kind of game it's trying to be. Well, a lot of games are trying to be grounded, realistic games, so that's the aesthetic. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think every game does try to have an aesthetic that fits what it's trying to be. I can't really think of any games that have like that are like trying to be one thing, but like, oh, but we want it to look like this, so we're gonna have like two completely conflicting things go together. There probably are things like games like that, but I'm pretty sure most developers want their games to be cohesive, you know. Regarding the graphics discourse, I feel like a lot of what we think looks better or worse is just vibes. Well, like, yeah, like aesthetics is what like the real subjectivity comes down to, I think.